lines of poetry began with Kulthum after Karbala. When they reached Kufa, the sister of Sayyida Zainab began with lines of poetry. And therefore the trend was set that majalis would incorporate poetry about what happened on the 10th of Muharram. Furthermore, you find that according to the school of Ahlul Bayt, azadari in the form of majalis included what was known as crying. And crying was seen as having been originated as well from the time of the prophets, and included the angels as well. For we find in Ziyarat Nahiya, the Imam says, As-salamu ala man bakathu malaikatu as-sama. Peace be on the one who the angels of the heavens cried for him. Therefore, the idea of crying for Abu Abdullah al-Hussein was seen as an institution which began with the angels, all the prophets of God, and the Prophet himself, who cries in front of his wife Salama. When he cries in front of her, she asks him why. He discusses what will happen on the 10th of Muharram. In terms of the voice, the changing of the voice in Masa'ib, this form of azadari, unique very much to the Arab world, not so much the Indo-Pak subcontinent. The Indo-Pak subcontinent, the reciter continues the Masa'ib actually by raising his voice. There's no change of voice at all. He only makes his voice louder. In the Arabic world, there is a change of voice, you will notice. That change of voice originates with Imam al-Sadiq, who when someone started giving a majlis, when it came towards the Masa'ib, Imam al-Sadiq said to him, recite in the tone of the people of Iraq. Because that type of Masa'ib, that is what makes us cry. Therefore, when a person changes his voice in Masa'ib, that form of azadari is seen as being originally with whom? Originally with the Imam. Therefore, we have majlis, which began with the prophets, crying as an institution, which began with the prophets of God, and we have as well, as we said, the next point that emerges in this area was the voice. Then the question about matam, okay, about the beating of the chest. The question is, when did this originate? First and foremost, it's narrated that matam, or beating oneself, originated when the Prophet himself died. That in the book Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, the narration comes forward that when the Prophet died, the wives of Rasulullah began to beat their faces or slap their faces. In terms of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, when did slapping or beating one's chest or faces, when did it begin? We have a narration that it began straight after Karbala, or during the midst of what was happening to Abu Abdullah. We take this from where? Again, from Ziyarat Nahiya. Let me just explain to you what is Ziyarat Nahiya. And as I said, question and answer will go into more depth. We're skimming through this at the moment. Ziyarat Nahiya is the 12th Imam's version of what happened on the 10th of Muharram. The way he looks back at what happened to his grandfather on the 10th of Muharram. Nahiya means the sacred place. And it's narrated in one of the narrations that the sacred place refers to the house of Imam al-Askari, from where this originally was written. And Ziyarat Nahiya is seen as being authentic according to many of the scholars of narration. In Ziyarat Nahiya, there is a narration which says, the Imam describing Karbala, he describes how the women of Karbala began slapping themselves when they saw what happened to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. When he says, وَنَظَرْنَا سَرْجَكَ عَلَيْهِ مَلْوِيًّا برزنا من الخدور ناشرات الشعور على الخدود لاطمات الوجوه سافرات, and so on. And that the translation is, at that time your horse galloped towards your camp, weeping and neighing. When your ladies saw your rider, your riderless horse, and the saddle which had slipped downwards, they became restless and they came out of their tents. They slapped their own faces and they wailed and they lamented. They were calling their elders and ancestors in a dejected condition after having been so much respected. They all headed towards your place of slaughter. Therefore you find that in terms of matam, or in terms of slapping a part of the body, we find that this originated from Karbala. And it's narrated that Sayyida Zainab herself beat herself on 3 separate occasions, according to 2 different books. One book is Al-Bidaya wal-Nihaya, and the second book is Al-Imama wal-Siyasa. Within these books it says Sayyida Zainab beat herself on 3 occasions. First narration says that she began to slap herself when the enemy planned to attack the camp of Imam al-Hussein. Sayyida Zainab went to Imam al-Hussein, asked him, what is this noise outside our tents? Imam al-Hussein replied, I just saw a dream where the Prophet of Allah told me that they would reach me by tomorrow. Upon hearing this, Sayyida Zainab began to slap her face. A second narration is, Sayyida Zainab began to slap her face when she heard Imam al-Hussein narrate his final verses before he died on the 10th of Muharram. A third narration is Sayyida Zainab began to slap her face when they went past the battlefield on the 10th of Muharram and saw the holy bodies on the ground. Therefore, Matam as an institution, the idea of slapping one's body, begins with the companions of Imam al-Hussein straight after the Battle of Karbala. In terms of julus, as a form of azadari, julus is taken from the idea that the companions of Imam al-Hussein, or the family, went from Karbala towards Kufa, towards Sham, back to Karbala, and back to Medina. Hence, julus is that march which was a stand against injustice. And therefore the azadari of julus is one that continues today, and it is based on the action of Ahlul Bayt. As for Zinjir and Qamazani, Zinjir, in my opinion, there is no basis to it from the actions of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. In terms, however, of why it became a cultural practice, for a number of reasons according to different scholars. One opinion is Zinjir became a cultural practice because of memory of the way Imam Zain al-Abidin used to get whipped when he was walking. So when he's going from Karbala towards Kufa, towards Sham, they would whip him on his back, and therefore people would do the same in honor. A second opinion is that this form of self-flagellation began with a group of people by the name of the Tawwabun, the repenters, those who were not at Karbala. Tawbah means repentance. They felt guilty, they were not at Karbala. They said, we swear that we will avenge what happened at Karbala. They were not at Karbala for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is they were not at Karbala because they were more inclined to the world than going towards losing their lives. Another of the reasons is no, they couldn't make it to Karbala because they were imprisoned. For example, Mukhtar was imprisoned and could not make Karbala. When they came out, the tawbah within them, the repentance, made them feel guilty. They began to flagellate themselves. They flagellated themselves a couple of years after Karbala, and therefore it was then seen as a tradition that in the same way Ahlul Bayt faced a period of faced a period of being whipped, their followers would go through this action as well. It came to prominence in the Safavid Empire in Iran and in Turkey as well, where it continues until today in the Arabic as well as the Indo-Pak subcontinent. Zinjir. Qamazani, those who advocate Qamazani, the hitting of the sword on the head, they narrate a hadith about Sayyida Zainab on her way towards where? On her way towards Sham. The people who take the practice of tatbir, as it is known in the Arabic language, they say that Sayyida Zainab, sister of Imam al-Hussein, was the first person who hit her forehead to a bar inside the carriage she was in, causing considerable bleeding when the head of Imam al-Hussein was taken towards Kufa. And they say, those who advocate Qamazani, that in the same way Sayyida Zainab struck her head on a bar because she saw the head of her brother, then it's permissible for us to strike ourselves with such an instrument or something as sharp as that. Therefore, you have all of these different types of azadari: majlis, crying, julus, voice, zinjir, matam, qamazani. All of these, you will find that people will come forward and say what? People will come forward and say that there is a basis to Ahlul Bayt in these actions. As for the ones where they